Justice for Maya Carter, the 12-year-old girl who shook the legal system. On a gentle Wednesday afternoon in Houston, Texas, as the golden hues of sunset painted the sky, 12-year-old Maya Carter stood outside the school gate. With her naturally curly hair, a striking portrait of pride and elegance, she was waiting for her father to pick her up. The air was filled with the chatter and laughter of students after class. Yet in that moment, Maya stood out from the crowd. Her voluminous curls, meticulously cared for since childhood, were not just a defining feature but a symbol of identity and deep-rooted pride. Amid what seemed like an ordinary moment, a police car pulled up not far away, drawing the attention of those nearby. Stepping out was Officer Grant, a broad-shouldered man with neatly trimmed hair, his sharp gaze carrying an air of authority. His presence cast a sudden tension over the scene, sending a chill down Maya's spine, though she tried to explain that she was simply waiting for her father. An unsettling fear welled up inside her as Officer Grant's skeptical eyes bore into her. Heavy with unspoken judgment, the first few moments of this fateful encounter marked the beginning of a turning point, where a simple misunderstanding had the potential to spiral into life-altering consequences. In the silence of the watching crowd, an unjust decision loomed, ready to shape the destiny of a gifted young girl in an instant. Maya swallowed hard, trying to steady herself as Officer Grant approached. Her heart pounded against her ribs when his cold, assessing gaze swept over her. "What are you doing here?" His voice wasn't exactly harsh, but it carried an undeniable authority. Maya looked up, willing herself not to show fear. "I'm just waiting for my dad to pick me up." Grant narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing her. "What's your name?" She hesitated. She knew she wasn't obligated to answer, but something about his stare made her uneasy. "Maya Carter." Immediately, Grant reached for the radio on his shoulder. "I've got a young black female, approximately 12 years old, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. Possible match for a missing person report." Maya froze. "I'm not missing," she protested, her voice trembling with outrage. "I can call my dad." But Grant wasn't listening. He nodded at something through his radio before turning back to her. His expression firm. "You need to come with me to the station so we can confirm your identity." A wave of fear crashed over Maya. "No, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just waiting for my dad." Grant reached for her wrist. She instinctively jerked back, but he was faster. The icy clamp of handcuffs snapped around her small wrist, knocking the breath from her lungs. Students nearby started to notice. A few gaped in shock, but no one stepped forward. Finally, a teacher hurried over. "Wait, what's going on here?" the teacher asked, clearly alarmed. Grant barely spared her a glance. "Possible runaway situation. Taking her in for verification." The teacher frowned. "But I know this student. She's not a runaway." Grant shrugged, unconcerned. "We'll be the judge of that." Maya's eyes darted around, silently pleading for someone to intervene. But no one did. Her pulse pounded wildly as she was ushered toward the police car. Step by step, the door swung open. Grant pushed her into the backseat and slammed it shut. Maya twisted around, desperation rising in her throat. "My dad is on his way. This is a mistake." Grant only smirked through the partition glass. "They all say that." The car pulled away from the school, leaving Maya behind with nothing but the cold grip of fear tightening around her chest. Maya sat stiffly in the backseat of the police car, her wide eyes fixed on the window as her school faded into the distance. She tried to take deep breaths, but every inhale made her chest feel tighter, as if something was crushing her from the inside. Her wrists ached from the cold metal of the handcuffs. She stole a glance down, noticing the red marks beginning to form on her brown skin. A surge of anger flared up inside her, but fear quickly swallowed it whole. She was only 12. How could she possibly fight back against an officer like Grant? He drove with an unsettling calmness, as if arresting an innocent child was just another routine task. From the rearview mirror, his eyes flicked to hers, his lips curving into a faint smirk. "Got a guardian? Someone we can call?" His tone sounded procedural, but Maya wasn't fooled. He had never cared to listen to her from the beginning. "My dad," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "He's on his way to pick me up from school. This is a mistake." Grant chuckled softly, shaking his head. "They all say that." Maya clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, sending a sharp sting through her hands. I have my student ID in my bag. If you just check it, you'll see I'm not a runaway. But Grant didn't even glance back. We'll check when we get to the station. She bit her lip hard to keep the tears from spilling over. She couldn't cry. She refused to let him see her cry. Outside, the streets of Houston blurred past. The familiar stores, the roads she had walked so many times with her dad, suddenly. They all felt distant, foreign, and terrifying. After about 10 minutes, the police car pulled into a gated lot behind the Houston Police Department. The massive metal doors slowly slid open, swallowing the car whole. Maya felt her stomach twist into knots. The vehicle came to a stop. Grant stepped out first, then yanked open the back door. Out. Maya didn't move. She knew resisting wouldn't help. But her entire body trembled with a mixture of fury and terror. Grant exhaled impatiently before grabbing her arm and pulling her out, forcing her to walk beside him. She stumbled forward, her eyes darting around, hoping, praying, that someone would stop and ask what was going on. But no one did. Other officers went about their business, some sparing her a glance before turning away, as if this were just another normal day. Her heart cracked at the indifference. Grant led her through the station's main entrance, down a narrow hallway that smelled like disinfectant. The noise and liveliness of her school just minutes ago felt like a world away. Near the front desk, a female officer turned to look at them. Sergeant Olivia Lewis, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, immediately frowned when she saw Maya. "What's this?" she asked, suspicion clear in her voice. Grant shrugged as if it were nothing. "Picked her up outside a school. Matches a runaway report." Lewis gave Maya a once-over before turning back to Grant, skepticism evident on her face. "Did you verify anything yet?" Grant smirked. "We'll clear it up here." Maya seized the opportunity. "I'm not a runaway. My name is Maya Carter. My dad is supposed to pick me up from school. But he won't find me because she shot a glare at Grant. Her voice filled with fury. "Arrested me for no reason." Lewis' frown deepened. "Do you have any ID on you?" Maya nodded quickly. "In my bag, if you just check." Grant cut her off. "We'll deal with that later. Right now, she needs to be placed in holding." Maya's breath caught in her throat. "What?" Lewis gave Grant a long, hard look. "She's just a kid." Grant folded his arms, completely unfazed. "Protocol is protocol." Lewis pressed her lips into a thin line. "Are you sure you're following the right protocol?" For a brief second, Grant hesitated, but rather than admit any mistake, he simply shrugged. "Just following orders." Maya felt like she was going to explode from helplessness. She looked at Lewis, silently pleading for her to do something. Anything. For a moment, Lewis hesitated, but then, with a quiet sigh, she nodded. "Come on, kid." Maya clenched her fists, but she had no choice. She followed the sergeant, her footsteps heavy, weighed down by a world that suddenly felt unbearably unfair. Behind her, Grant stood with his arms crossed, a smug smirk playing on his lips. What he didn't know was that, in just a few minutes, his entire world was about to change forever. Maya followed Sergeant Lewis down the long hallway, her stomach twisted with anxiety. Officers bustled around them, typing on computers, answering phones, jotting notes in their reports. No one stopped to ask questions. No one seemed to care that a 12-year-old girl had just been wrongfully detained. The room Lewis led her into wasn't a holding cell with bars. But it wasn't much better. It was a small processing room, cold gray walls, a metal table, a few hard plastic chairs, and a flickering fluorescent light overhead. "Sit," Lewis said, her tone not exactly harsh, but far from warm. Maya sat, clasping her hands tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. "Please, ma'am, just call my dad," she pleaded. Lewis sighed, pulling a form from a file. "Full name?" "Maya Carter." Lewis typed a few words into the computer. But before she could continue, the door swung open. Grant walked in, but he wasn't carrying paperwork or documents to confirm Maya's identity. He was holding a pair of scissors. Maya's heart nearly stopped. Lewis frowned. "What the hell is this?" Grant shrugged, twirling the scissors between his fingers. "Just standard procedure. Gotta make sure detainees are clean." Lewis crossed her arms, her expression sharpening. "Don't tell me you're about to do what I think you're about to do." Grant smirked, tilting his head. "Kids come in here. We have to ensure hygiene." Her hair. He gestured toward Maya. Who knows what could be in there? A wave of cold terror crashed over Maya. Instinctively, her hands shot up to her head. No, she screamed, scrambling backward. You can't do that. Grant took a step closer. Hold still. Kid, it'll be quick. Maya's panicked eyes darted to Lewis, silently begging for help. The sergeant hesitated, but before she could react, Grant lunged forward. Maya shot up from her chair, trying to dodge, but Grant was faster. He grabbed the collar of her hoodie and yanked her back. Let me go, she cried, thrashing against his grip, tears spilling down her cheeks. Lewis shot to her feet. What the hell are you doing? Grant shot her an irritated look. She's resisting. But Lewis had had enough. She grabbed Grant's wrist and yanked it away from Maya. Back off. Grant jerked his arm free. But Lewis' eyes had turned to steel. I'm not letting you do this. The air in the room thickened. The two officers stood locked in a silent standoff, one dripping with arrogance and unchecked power, the other with fury and resolve. And in that moment, Maya knew Grant wasn't going to back down easily. This wasn't over. Grant tightened his grip on the scissors, his eyes flashing with defiance as he glared at Sergeant Lewis. Are you interfering with my job? Lewis didn't blink. You're abusing your authority. Maya shrank back, clutching her hair as if it were the only thing protecting her. She had never felt so small, so powerless. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, her mind spinning with terror. Grant scoffed, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Fine, if you don't want to get involved, step aside and let me do my job. Then he lunged forward, grabbing a fistful of Maya's curls and yanking her head back. Maya screamed, struggling against his grip. Pain shot through her scalp as his rough fingers dug into her skin. She felt utterly helpless, but before the blades could touch a single strand of her hair, another hand clamped down, tight and unyielding, around Grant's wrist. Enough. Sergeant Lewis' voice cut through the room like a blade. Everything froze. Grant whipped his head around, fury blazing in his eyes. What the hell do you think you're doing? Lewis' grip didn't waver. You've gone too far. Grant, this isn't procedure. This is humiliation. Grant let out a bitter laugh and yanked his arm free. You're kidding me, right? It's just a kid. No. Lewis interrupted, her voice steady and commanding. She's a human being, and I won't let you violate her rights. Maya gasped, tears streaming down her face. She could hardly believe it. Someone was finally standing up for her. Grant glared at Lewis, his jaw tightening. He was torn between pushing his authority further or backing down. Rage simmered in his eyes. But then, abruptly, he scoffed and tossed the scissors onto the table with a sharp clank. Fine, he muttered. If you want to make this your problem, be my guest. He spun on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The room fell into a heavy silence. Maya was still shaking, her breaths uneven. Lewis lowered herself into a chair beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Are you okay? Maya swallowed hard and nodded. But the tears wouldn't stop. Lewis sighed, then reached for her phone. We're calling your dad, right now. But before she could dial, the door swung open again. This time, it wasn't Grant. A tall, broad-shouldered man with piercing eyes stepped inside, his police uniform crisp, a gleaming badge pinned to his chest. Captain Ross. His gaze swept the room, taking in the discarded scissors, Maya's tear-streaked face, and Lewis' tense expression. Then his eyes hardened. His voice was low and commanding. Somebody want to tell me what the hell is going on here? Sergeant Lewis shot to her feet the moment Captain Ross entered the room. For a brief second, the air seemed to freeze. Maya remained curled up in the chair, her breathing still unsteady, tear tracks still fresh on her cheeks. Captain Ross, a man of stern presence and piercing eyes, scanned the room, his gaze lingering on Maya's red, swollen eyes before shifting to Lewis. His voice, deep and authoritative, cut through the silence. Sergeant, I want a full report. Now. Lewis took a deep breath. Standing straight. Sir, Officer Grant detained this child without cause. When I insisted on verifying her identity, he refused. He then attempted to cut her hair under the guise of hygiene procedure. I intervened before he could do anything further. Ross's frown deepened, his disapproval clear. He turned to Maya. What's your name? His voice, though still firm, softened noticeably when addressing her. Maya swallowed, trying to steady herself. Maya Carter. Sir. Ross nodded, then turned back to Lewis. Did she have any identification on her? Lewis responded immediately. Yes, sir. She told Grant her student ID was in her backpack, but he refused to check before detaining her. Ross pressed his lips into a thin line. Clearly displeased, he stepped closer to Maya, lowering himself slightly to meet her gaze. Can you tell me where your bag is? Maya inhaled deeply, then nodded. It's a black backpack. There's a star-shaped keychain on the zipper. Ross turned toward the door and motioned to another officer. Find the girl's backpack, now. The officer hurried out. Ross straightened, folding his arms. I want to know everything that happened. Lewis cleared her throat and began recounting the events, from the moment Grant approached Maya outside her school. His refusal to listen, his aggressive behavior, and ultimately, his attempt to cut her hair. Maya sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly together, emotions swirling inside her. A minute later, the officer returned, holding her backpack. Ross took it, unzipped it, and pulled out a student ID card. He studied it for a moment, then slowly lifted his gaze. Maya Carter, 7th grade, Riverside Middle School. Home address matches the system records. No missing person report has ever been filed for her. His expression darkened as he exhaled sharply. Ross turned to Lewis. Where is her father? I'm calling him right now. Lewis replied, dialing the number. Maya looked up at Ross, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with hope. Does my dad know? Ross nodded, his tone more reassuring now. We'll make sure he knows exactly what happened. But before he could say anything else, a deep voice resonated from the doorway. There's no need. Everyone turned. A tall man stepped into the room, clad in a sharp charcoal gray suit. His presence commanding, his face was as cold as stone, his piercing eyes scanning the room before settling on Maya. She shot up from her seat. Dad, Judge Malcolm Carter had arrived. Kove nu kao tra loi kua min bai kat non du loi he thong. Min say teep tuk kao choyan dung voi din bien ne. Blank. Underscore, blank. Maya clung tightly to her father's hand as the officer left the room to retrieve the surveillance footage. Her heart was still pounding, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt safe. Her father, Judge Malcolm Carter, was here. And nothing, not even Officer Grant, could stand against him. Captain Ross shifted uncomfortably under the weight of Carter's gaze. I assure you, Judge Carter, we will handle this situation appropriately. Carter let out a slow, measured breath. You're damn right you will. Grant, who had been standing stiffly, finally spoke up, his voice laced with forced confidence. Look, this is getting blown out of proportion. I was just following standard protocol. Carter turned to him, his expression dark. Standard protocol would have required you to verify my daughter's identity before putting her in handcuffs. Standard protocol would have involved contacting the school or her guardian. What you did was not protocol. Officer Grant, what you did was racial profiling, excessive force, and outright misconduct. Grant opened his mouth to protest, but Carter took a deliberate step closer. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of authority. You put your hands on my daughter. You humiliated her, and then, when questioned, you refused to admit you were wrong. The room was deathly silent. A knock on the door broke the tension, and an officer entered, carrying a tablet. Sir, I have the footage queued up. Ross gestured for it to be played. The video began. The grainy security footage showed Maya standing outside her school, scrolling on her phone. Grant's police car pulled up. He approached her, speaking briefly before grabbing her wrist and slapping handcuffs on her without hesitation. Maya's face was twisted in confusion and fear as she struggled to explain. The footage showed students and a teacher looking on in shock. Then came the most damning part, inside the station. The video caught Grant pulling out the scissors, Lewis stepping in, and the heated confrontation that followed. Carter's face remained unreadable, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. Captain Ross exhaled heavily. That's enough. He turned to Grant, his jaw tight. Officer Grant, turn in your badge and gun. Effective immediately. You are suspended pending investigation. Grant's face turned red. You can't be serious. I am serious. Ross snapped. You are a liability to this department. Lewis watched, arms crossed, as Grant fumed, but before he could argue further, Carter spoke one last time. You will be hearing from my attorney." Grant paled. For the first time, real fear flickered across his face. Maya squeezed her father's hand as Grant was escorted out of the room. Finally, it was over. Or at least, the beginning of the end. As the surveillance footage played, the air in the room grew thick with tension. All eyes were locked onto the screen, where every detail unfolded with crystal clarity. There was Maya, a small, frightened 12-year-old girl, standing outside her school, trying to remain calm as Officer Grant interrogated her. She didn't resist. She didn't act suspiciously. Yet, right there for everyone to see, Grant ignored her every word, slapped handcuffs on her wrists, and dragged her toward his patrol car as if she were a dangerous criminal. Maya stared at the screen, her throat tightening. Seeing herself in that moment, helpless, scared, pleading, was far worse than living through it. Now, from an outsider's perspective, she could fully grasp the cruelty in Grant's actions. The footage cut to the police station. Maya was shoved into the processing room, still handcuffed, her small frame trembling as she tried to maintain her composure. Then Grant appeared, a pair of gleaming scissors in his hand. A heavy silence settled over the room as they all watched the next few seconds unfold. Grant grabbed a fistful of Maya's curls, yanking her head back so roughly that her neck snapped upward. His expression was disturbingly smug, as if this were nothing more than a trivial task. The way he held the scissors, the sheer disregard in his face, it was undeniable. Then Sergeant Lewis stormed in, stepping between them, yanking Grant away. The footage showed their struggle. The moment Lewis pushed back and put a stop to it, she had stopped a blatant abuse of power. The video ended. No one spoke. The weight of what they had just witnessed hung heavy in the air. Slowly, Judge Malcolm Carter turned to Grant. His expression no longer burned with rage. Instead, it was cold, filled with something far worse, disgust. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" His voice was low, but every syllable carried a dangerous authority. Grant swallowed hard. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. I was just following my judgment." "Judgment?" Carter's lip curled. "Then let me tell you exactly what your judgment led to." He took a slow step forward, his presence commanding, each movement like a hammer striking down on Grant's already crumbling confidence. "You arrested a child without cause. You refused to verify her identity, despite her asking multiple times. You attempted to humiliate her by cutting off her hair, a violation not found in any policy, any law, or any standard of conduct." Maya gripped her father's hand tightly, feeling the fury radiating from him like a storm about to break. "And worst of all," Carter continued, his voice sharp as a blade, "you did all of this to the daughter of a federal judge." Grant turned ghostly pale. Captain Ross cleared his throat, breaking the unbearable silence. "Judge Carter, I assure you, this will be thoroughly investigated. Officer Grant will be suspended effective immediately." "No," Carter interrupted, "that's not enough." His sharp gaze turned to Ross. "No longer making requests but issuing commands. I want him fired, and I want a full report of this incident sent to Internal Affairs. If I don't see decisive action within 24 hours, I will personally file a lawsuit in federal court." Ross stiffened. It was clear he didn't want this situation to escalate any further, but he also knew there was no stopping Malcolm Carter when he had made up his mind. Slowly, he gave a single nod. "Understood." Carter turned back to Grant, giving him one last, piercing look before placing a steady hand on Maya's shoulder. His expression softened as he looked at her. "Let's go home, sweetheart." Maya didn't hesitate. She clung to her father's hand and walked out with him, never looking back. This time, as they left, every pair of eyes in the police station turned to Grant, the man who had just realized, far too late, that he had lost everything. Grant stood frozen in place, his eyes blank with shock as he watched his career crumble before him. Around the station, other officers looked on, but no one spoke up in his defense. No one dared to stand beside a man who had just been exposed so publicly. Meanwhile, Maya walked beside her father, feeling the steady strength of his grip in her hand. As they stepped outside the station, the golden afternoon sun bathed them in its warmth, but it also shone a harsh light on an undeniable truth: she had been wronged. Yet, she was not alone. Outside, a crowd had already gathered: reporters, protesters, people who had come demanding justice. Whether the surveillance footage had leaked or the story had spread across social media, it was clear that Maya's ordeal had struck a nerve. Signs were raised high above the crowd. Justice for Maya Carter. End police abuse. No one is above the law. Maya stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening as the chants filled the air. Carter, Carter, we stand with Maya. Her father's grip tightened reassuringly. His voice remained calm. They're here for you. Maya swallowed hard. She had never imagined herself at the center of something like this. All she had wanted was to go home, curl up on the couch with a book, and forget this nightmare ever happened. But now, this was bigger than just her. A reporter pushed forward, microphone in hand. Judge Carter, can you comment on today's events? Malcolm Carter paused. He gave Maya's hand a small squeeze before turning to face the cameras. His expression steady, his gaze unwavering. You've all seen what happened, he said, his voice low but carrying immense weight. My daughter was treated inhumanely. But the truth is, this isn't just about Maya Carter. This is about countless other black children who are profiled, mistreated, and criminalized for simply existing. The crowd fell silent, hanging on to every word. I am not just here as a father protecting his child. I am here as someone who will ensure that no other child has to endure what Maya went through today. The crowd erupted in cheers. Cameras flashed. Maya looked up at her father. And for the first time that day, the fear inside her began to fade. Her father would not let this go unanswered. And now, neither would the thousands of people standing behind them. That night, Maya Carter's story didn't just stay in Houston. It spread like wildfire, igniting a nationwide movement. The leaked police surveillance footage flooded social media. And within hours, it became the biggest topic across all platforms. News headlines dominated the airwaves. Houston officer suspended after wrongful detainment of 12-year-old girl. Judge Malcolm Carter takes on the police system after shocking incident. Public outrage grows over police mistreatment of black children. Celebrities, activists, and even politicians began to speak out. From viral tweets and Instagram posts to in-depth analysis on major news channels, everyone was talking about Maya Carter. Inside the Carter family's apartment, Maya sat curled up on the couch, her eyes glued to the TV screen. Her own image flashed across the news, a terrified 12-year-old in handcuffs, her body recoiling as Grant grabbed her hair. It felt surreal. She was watching herself, yet it didn't feel like her. It was as if she were seeing a stranger, someone caught in the middle of a storm far bigger than she had ever imagined. Beside her, her father sat with his phone vibrating constantly, calls from lawyers, reporters, even local officials. But he wasn't distracted. His focus remained on Maya. His eyes filled with the same unwavering concern he had shown when he first stepped into that police station hours ago. You okay? His voice was low and warm. Maya shrugged. I don't know. Malcolm Carter sighed, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I know this is overwhelming. You didn't ask for any of this. But you were incredibly brave. Maya. She bit her lip. It's just, so much. I didn't think it would become this big. That's because it's not just about you, he said gently. This is about every other child who's been mistreated but didn't have anyone to stand up for them. Maya was silent. She thought back to how helpless she had felt when Grant grabbed her. How no one had intervened. She had believed, for even a moment, that she was alone. But now, seeing the thousands of people rallying behind her, she knew that wasn't true. So, what happens next? She asked. Her voice small but steady. Her father looked at her, then slowly smiled. We make sure this never gets forgotten. We fight for justice, not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been treated like this. Maya Carter's story was no longer just a personal incident. It had become a symbol of a much larger fight. Under the relentless scrutiny of the media, pressure on the Houston Police Department and local government mounted. Protesters filled the streets, human rights organizations intervened, and public figures demanded a deeper investigation. No one was willing to let this injustice be swept under the rug. Judge Malcolm Carter didn't stop at getting Grant fired. He filed a lawsuit, not just against the officer, but against the entire system that had enabled such abuse of power. The Carter family's legal team vowed to see the case through to the end, holding not only Grant accountable but also those who had stood by and allowed it to happen. 3 months after the incident, Houston implemented new policies regarding the arrest of minors. enforcing stricter oversight and explicitly banning practices like the ones Maya had endured. What had started as one girl's terrifying experience had sparked an unexpected wave of reform. But more importantly, Maya Carter had learned something invaluable. Justice does not arrive on its own. Justice is something you fight for. The 12-year-old girl who had once been scared and powerless had now found her voice. She realized that even one person, one child, could make a difference when backed by hundreds, thousands, even millions who refused to stay silent. So, if you witness injustice around you, what will you do? Will you turn away? Or will you be the one who stands up and demands change? Because the world doesn't change because of silence. It changes when people rise and say, enough.